let me find the right slides. Okay. And if I swap displays, is that the right screen for people to see, or are you seeing presenter mode?
Looks good.
Looks good.
Fantastic. Excellent. Thanks everyone for joining. This is the latest seminar in the Complex Risk Science seminar series that we began in August as a bit of an experiment to explore the various dimensions that come in when you start to think about risk science from a complexity science perspective. So really, this has been an exploration in new frontiers and a new community for understanding risk. So very excited to have two new speakers this week to introduce a new element of this complex risk science seminar. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Ryan McGranigan. I'm a researcher at the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory and the one who's been curating these events. So just as I'm going to make sure people are admitted here. One moment. So I'm going to try and give as much time as possible to our speakers and only provide a short framing today. We've talked about this in the past, and you can look up our detailed description of how we conceive of complex risk science via the YouTube channel, and that link is in the chat. But in short, risk is this combination of likelihood of some event happening times an exposure of some element you're interested in the way of that event, and then this most difficult aspect of the problem, which is the characterization of vulnerability, which can be the vulnerability of a piece of critical infrastructure or the vulnerability of a population or an individual within that. And so it's the probabilistic characterization of the state of the natural world alongside this quantification of exposure and susceptibility. A colleague of ours who has been a pioneer in the idea of complex risk science kind of has this definition of risk science here, and I'll let you take a look at that. But Sobel very much has been someone we've been learning a lot from in these. There's been a lot of work towards understanding risk from this perspective, and we're trying to give it a space for extended discussion. So we've talked about this image here, and we had Jane Baldwin give a seminar in the past on how she has been trying to do a full-scale end-to-end risk analysis for things like tropical cyclones, and how do we characterize that in the context of changing climate, combining not only the natural hazard characterization from a probabilistic perspective, but also the exposure, in this case, households that were affected by those extreme winds and precipitation, but then characterizing the vulnerability. What is the intensity of the hazard that corresponds to failure or probability of failure for those different assets? And then that allows you to do the full scale kind of understanding of what's lost and the impact to that. So you can do the full scale risk characterization from that. One of the things we're going to hear about today, and this is kind of the lead into our speakers, is that perceptions of risks are driven as much by emotional response, or perhaps more, as a rational accounting of the unpredictability of outcomes or likelihood of magnitude of loss. And further, risks are always created and affected in social systems, and their magnitude is a function of the quality of social relations and processes, and is mediated by social dependency upon institutions in which the individuals and communities affected by the risk remain illegible. So the recognition of these perceptual and social elements of risk are momentous discoveries in the process of risk science, and they require that risks and returns be considered subjective impressions, and the framework to support taking and or mitigating risk must be contextual, individually, situationally, and culturally. And so the totality of risk is then the physical and social conditions as well as the cultural and perceptual construction. And so if we want to hold the complexity of risk with integrity, it means to explore the interstitial space between the physical and social dimensions. Climate offers a wonderful example of this. So this figure kind of shows the changing risk perceptions related to climate change over time, detailing both complexity of perceptions and elements related to psychological distance. It's pulled from the Yale program on climate change communication, which is a resource well worth your time in kind of exploring. But what this is kind of showing is that risk perceptions affect what is the appropriate response, and those perceptions are a factor of a host of conditions, including personal preference and history and local environment and culture. And so in climate specifically, it's long been claimed that psychological distance, or the perception of how removed an object is from.
I don't want to go, but you should go.
Let me just 1 second. Okay. So this is a kind of an idea that psychological distance, or the perception of how removed an object, event, or risk is from an individual, is a barrier to climate action. but there's kind of ambiguous findings across the climate literature that challenge that simple relationship. And the climate community has responded by more deeply involving social scientists and psychologists in the study of perceptions of climate change and extreme weather, and developing mature psychological or sociological instruments to more directly connect those perceptions. And so today we're going to be basically following in that path, engaging with two of the leading thinkers about the social and psychological sides of risk, especially how they're connected to the physical. So as always, what we're trying to do with these seminar series is evolve our understanding and our ability to characterize risk toward complexity. So that's an approach driven by the complexity science, the tools and methods from complexity science, including critical transitions, social elements as well, and also resilience. The central question of these is, as we start to improve and extend our understanding of what factors in to risk, what happens to that risk characterization? What does that mean for our decisions and for our systems? So the need that these seminars have attempted to have been served is to provide a place for sustained interaction among a more plural community that touches these different elements of that. And today is very much a perfect example of that. So we've talked about this before, but for those of you who are new to this and those who need a reminder, we try to provide cultivated forums for sustained interactions, not only be synchronous events, but also Slack space for people to interact and exchange resources more fluidly, asynchronously. And then this idea of fractal gathering, of how do we bring this community together across scales and media and registers to provide more meaningful exchange and organize this network towards these ends. We've also been cultivating data analyses and analysis working groups towards these various dimensions of risk science, complex risk science, and we're kind of housing projects and useful resources and code and things for doing this work on GitHub through a complex risk collective organization, GitHub organization. And so you can take a look there. It's relatively well organized. We'd love to hear your thoughts and have you contribute to things there as well. So today, as I mentioned, this has been a very deliberate effort over the past 6 months to try and build a progression towards complex risk science. How do we do that? And so you can see the past 5 speakers that we've had in this series, culminating in today's speaker, which is going to be these 2 speakers, which is going to be the final event of 2025. And so you can see that we began with understanding complex interconnected systems, acknowledging the uncertainty that's brought in and inherent in thinking about risk from a complex perspective. Then we began to think about the social, ecological, technological, or SETS dimensions of this with Elizabeth Kruger, and then end-to-end risk analyses from the physical science perspective to the risk characterization and quantification with Jane Baldwin. And then finally, a couple weeks ago, we heard from Alex Dunant about actually achieving multi-hazard representation and that technological aspect of this. All this is culminating today in starting to think about the social elements of this with Elke Weber and Sara Constantino. So their talk will be accounting for the social political feedbacks to identify barriers and opportunities for collective climate action. I want to mention, as I just stated, this is the last seminar for this year. Very interested in your experiences and your thoughts on this seminar series. We set this out as being an experiment, and we want to know your thoughts about how we continue this, if we continue this, and what purpose it has served for you. So you can grab a link. I'll put this link in the chat, but you can grab the QR code here. We have one more seminar planned for early 2026, and after that period, we'll be reassessing where these will be going. So I was originally introduced to the research from Elke Weber and Sara Constantino back in February during a workshop at Princeton called the Workshop on Critical Transitions in Socioecological Systems. It was a really eye-opening event, perhaps most importantly because it introduced me to their work. And I thought that they provide kind of a masterclass in the topics of risk aversion and social elements of risk science. And so I'm very excited to have them bring some of their research here. This will be just an introduction to the vast volumes of research that both of them have done. But just by way of introduction, Dr. Sara Constantino is an assistant professor at the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability in the Department of Environmental Social Sciences and a visiting research scholar at Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. She's also a faculty affiliate at SPARC and the Social Science Environmental Health Research Institute. Her research focuses on understanding the interplay between individual, collective, and institutional and ecological factors, including how they shape preferences, decisions, and experiences, and resilience to extreme events and shocks. Dr. Elke Weber is the Gerard R. Andlinger Professor in Energy and the Environment and the Professor of Psychology and Public Affairs at Princeton University. She's a member of both the German and the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. In 2016, she received the Distinguished Achievement Award from the Society for Risk Analysis. In 2023, the Patrick Supes Prize from the American Philosophical Society, and in 2024, the BBVA Frontiers of Knowledge Award in the Social Sciences. So without further ado, I am going to invite, I believe Elke Weber is going to go first to share her research with us. Thank you so much, Elke, and thank you, Sara, for doing this.
Thanks so much, Ryan, for this generous introduction. And let me see if I can get my slides up again. So I think this one. Yeah, I think here we are.
That's great.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set things up by telling you a little bit about the human perceptions of risk. And yeah, Ryan already introduced us very nicely to the significance of that topic, for the seminar series. And so what I want to argue is that agents of action, collective action, or any other action for that matter, are we, Homo sapiens, and not Homo economicus. And that's despite the fact that both in economics, in political science, and engineering, still the ruling assumption about how decisions get made and how risks are assessed is one of rational choice and rational expectations. However, in the meantime, we have gotten 3 Nobel Prizes in economic sciences, from Simon back in 1978, and then Danny Kahneman in 2002, Richard Thaler most recently in 2017, that provide us with a much better characterization of human decision makers, Homo sapiens. And one thing that we've learned is that human decision makers have a much broader range of goals, and also of motivations. So we have material goals, of course. There's nothing wrong with the assumptions of economics. But we also have social goals. We have psychological goals. We want to be confident in our decisions. And those goals can provide us with a larger number of entry points in how to motivate choice and how to motivate decisions. On top of that, as another way of sort of having not just being not cognitive misers, but actually sort of having an abundance of processes is to having a broader range of judgment and choice processes. So yes, on the one hand, we make analytic decisions. We assess risk in analytic ways, like Ryan mentioned, risk being likelihood times exposure times vulnerability. But at the same time, oftentimes our decisions and our judgments are driven by emotions and by personal experience as a second very important category. And then the third category has to do with making decisions based on rules, and oftentimes rules based on our social role. So our social role as an employee, standard operating procedures, or as a good citizen, moral rules of conduct. And those ways of making judgments and choices oftentimes lead to somewhat different decisions. So see how to advance the next slide. Here we go. So one thing that we get with being Homo sapiens rather than Homo economicus, we have bounded rationality. Yes, so we have finite information processing capacity, finite attention, and because our resources are finite, we have to husband them carefully, wisely. And that means that perspective and perception matters. We can't pay attention and process everything at the same time. So we have to focus on things. And so therefore the angle by which we look at a decision, at a judgment, makes a difference. And so one important instantiation of that is that there's a big distinction between absolute versus relative encoding of outcomes. Expected utility theory, of course, assumes that sort of any kind of outcome is seen on a scale from 0 to infinity in some absolute sense. And prospect theory, 20 some years ago, provided, actually more than that, provided a very nice sort of band-aid to that, sort of basically accounting for the kinds of judgments and decisions that deviate from expected utility theory. The economists call those anomalies. And prospect theory explained that by introducing a reference point, like a given outcome might be seen as either good or bad, depending on what it's being compared to. There's a story attributed to James Thurber, who is this humorist writer from Ohio, and I spent a few years at Ohio State University, so I learned a lot of James Thurber stories. But yeah, he at some point had published a new book, and also had recently gotten married. And so the journalist asked him at some point, during the interview press conference, how do you like your new wife? And he said, compared to what? And that's a really good example of sort of how everything sort of in some sense has to do with compared to what. It's even sort of wired into our neural networks and our neural responses. And one way to think about that is imagine 3 buckets of water. One is very, very cold, ice water. The other one is very hot. And you put your left hand into the very hot water, your right hand into the ice water for a minute or two. And then you put both hands and put them into the middle bucket, which is just tap water. And your left hand that came out of the hot water will feel like it's in ice, and the right hand that came out of the very cold water will feel it's on fire, but they're both in the same bucket of tap water. And so it just sort of goes to show that our neurons actually encode change. And because sort of change for the better or change for the worse, is indicative of action being required. And so this idea of a reference point is very much sort of part of our sort of DNA and our neural network. It applies to very basic perceptions. So another Weber, and I wish I had formulated that Weber's law, but a much older psychophysicist, Ernst Weber, basically found back in 1834 that just noticeable differences, let's say in loudness, sort of are proportional to the starting point. So if I start at a very low level, I just have to crank up the dial of loudness a little bit before people will say, yeah, noticeably louder. But if the starting volume is already very high, I have to crank the dial quite a bit more before people will say noticeably louder. And so if this idea of relative encoding and this noticeable difference is just sort of change divided by starting value, if that holds for very basic perceptions, it probably also holds for complex perceptions. And so risk, for example, the assessment of magnitude of risk in economics is oftentimes seen as an absolute quantity, the variance of outcomes, the unpredictability of outcomes. If you think about sort of encoding risk, not in an absolute way, but in a relative way, you end up with a coefficient of variation, which is the standard deviation, which of course is just the square root of the variance. But you divide that, you standardize that by the expected value. So a small the same amount of variation applied around 0 is seen as very large, but the same amount of variation applied around $1 million, for example, is just seen as rounding error. And so this perception of risk per unit of return is psychophysically much more plausible. It goes back to Weber's law. It also is very nice because it's dimensionless. So you can actually compare the risk in different domains. And for that matter, it's being used in many applied areas. So I think its utility has spoken for itself. However, as I mentioned before, the coefficient of variation is not used in normative models of risky choice. That's true both for humans and for other animals. So in finance, for example, the risk return model in the capital asset pricing model basically decomposes willingness to pay, basically your preference for a risky option into a trade-off between expected value and from which you subtract sort of the riskiness, and their riskiness is seen as a variance of outcomes. And the assumption is that we don't like risk. Risk detracts from the attractiveness, from our willingness to pay for a risky option. Something very similar actually sort of has been formulated in biology. The energy budget rule for risk-sensitive optimal foraging also says that an animal will forage in a particular patch as a function of the expected value of the foraging and the variance again subtracts from the attractiveness of the patch. So a few years ago, while I was at Ohio State, actually I had lunch with an ecologist there who was studying risky foraging in birds and insects, and he was testing this energy budget rule by looking at choices where where animals, birds, or insects, were trying to decide between a sure thing, a patch that had a sure level of return, and a patch that had basically a two-outcome variable return. One was higher and the other was lower than the sure expected value. And this was a whole bunch of rewards, sucrose, popcorn kernels, also a whole bunch of animals. And in some of the decisions that he looked at in some of the studies, the energy budget was positive. In other words, the animals sort of were not starving, but they were just getting more nourishment than they currently had. And in 9 of them, actually, the energy budget was negative. The animals were in a starving state. And one thing that was interesting when he plotted, sort of people, animals' willingness to take the risky option, for example, as a function of risk, because the return in both options was the same. They were equated in the expected value. There was sort of no pattern to the data, so he was quite discouraged. And when we talked about the possibility that the coefficient of variation might actually sort of solve or make sense out of the noise, he plotted the willingness to take the risky option, or in this case, a constant option, as a function of the coefficient of variation, and all of a sudden this beautiful pattern emerged. Sort of in the positive budget, energy budget domain. The larger the coefficient of variation was, the more likely people were taking the sure thing, because the sure thing, when things are good, is better, than risky options. But when you're starving, and when the expected value, the sure expected value, basically makes sure you will starve, you will be more likely to take risk, and therefore the larger the variance, the larger the possible upside, in the negative budget situation was, the more likely people were taking the risky thing, or the less likely the sure thing. So what I showed you is that perceived risk is a subjective variable that seems to make a difference, compared to what is a difference, and compared to the expected value is the regularity I showed you just in the last set of slides. It also turns out that when you look at people's decisions in different risky domains, it's oftentimes hard to see that people have a constant risk attitude. So you might have friends who are crazy when it comes to recreational decisions. They go bungee jumping, they go skydiving, but then they leave 3 hours ahead of time to go to the airport because they're afraid of missing their plane. Or somebody who makes a very risky decision when it comes to financial decisions at work, but when they get home and make their own financial investment decisions, they're very risk averse. And so for a long time, I was actually sort of puzzled by that. And I was wondering whether or not it was, in fact, the case that there is no constant risk attitude. But that seems to be sort of contradicted by a lot of intuitions. We all sort of think that we know whether we are, by and large, more risk-taking or more risk-averse. And the fact that sort of when you look at risk-taking in different domains, it looks somewhat inconsistent. And so one thing we did with a colleague and a PhD student, we basically came up with a model that says, okay, risk-taking in a given domain is a function of, yes, your basic risk attitude, but also how you perceive the risks and returns in a given domain. And then let's show you the diagram on the slide. We basically analyze, and we ask people about risky decisions in 4 or 5 or 6 different domains, from ethical decisions to financial decisions to health and safety decisions, for example, recreational decisions. And we find that these decisions, in fact, are explained by a common risk attitude, which is sort of the height of the pink bars in each item that maps on different domains, but also by a domain-specific component, the green bars. And those green components have to do with how people perceive the risk in one domain as opposed to the other one. And oftentimes, they appear like they're risk-seeking, for example, not because they necessarily are risk-seeking as a constant attitude, but because they think the risk in this particular domain is very low. Oftentimes as a function of having lots of personal experience with something. Personal experience in a risky domain, making decisions there, not only oftentimes increases your liking of those alternatives, we all talk about familiarity breeds liking, but it also leads to oftentimes reduced perceptions of risk, because most of the time nothing bad happens. So perception of risks are a subjective variable, and what I want to argue, it's one that's oftentimes grounded in emotional assessments of risk. And I'll show you one other example of that, where we looked at changes in risk taking during the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. We were fortunate to have data from an online brokerage in the UK. And we knew how these customers were actually making financial decisions, to what extent they were actually investing in the stock portfolio at the bank, or putting their money into a safe account. And we contacted them at 3 months interval. We measured actually what they thought their willingness to take risks was, sort of their own subjective assessment. Are you more of a risk seeker or more of a risk averter? But also, we looking 3 months into the future, we asked them for the expectations of return and risks in 2 ways. One of them, measuring it analytically. What do you think the return of the stock portfolio, of the market portfolio, will be over the next 3 months in terms of percentage? Or asking them sort of, what do you think is the 5th percentile of returns? In the next 3 months, in the 95th percentile, so we can basically infer variance or standard deviation from that. Or we just ask them sort of, how good do you think the returns will be, or how risky do you think so it will be to be invested in the portfolio. And then we knew, then we were interested to what extent did these variables change over time, and how were changes in the actual risk taking that we observed in their portfolios related to these stated expectations about risks and return. And so here's, first of all, their own statements of risk tolerance. And as you can sort of see, from the beginning of the crisis, to the end of the crisis, their assessment of sort of how they saw their own risk tolerance didn't really change very much. Both sort of on average between individuals, but also for individual statements of that. But not surprisingly, the risk taking changed a lot. At the beginning, the top graph. At the beginning, risk taking went way down during the financial crisis, and then recovered towards the end. And that was very much explained by increased expectations of returns. And it's initially increased expectations of risk, but then also decreases again. And in combination, those two, the trade-off between those two, predicted their risk taking very well. I should say it was the emotionally judged perceived risk and the emotionally judged expected returns that predicted the actual risk taking, not the analytic ones, even though, and there was not actually a high degree of correlation between the analytic assessment and the emotional assessment. Okay, what is risk? And I'm going to come to a close fairly soon. On the one hand, we have risk as analysis. We already talked about that, and risk as a feeling. Risk as a feeling was introduced, sort of in the 1970s by a group of psychologists, Baruch Fischoff, Paul Slovic, Sara Lichtenstein, and they were actually commissioned by the nuclear power industry to figure out why the American public was not embracing nuclear power as a way of generating electricity, even though, clearly sort of experts were documenting that that was much safer in terms of morbidity or mortality statistics, than doing that by coal-generated power at the time. And they basically sort of compared nuclear power use to lots of other societal and technological risks, and reduced people's perceptions of these risks to 2 dimensions. So on the x-axis, we have basically the amount of dread people perceive. Is this like a risk that makes you feel very scared, or something that sort of this leaves you very cold? And on the y-axis, we have to what extent people thought these risks were under control. They could be controlled because they were well known, or not, or being catastrophic and unknown. And nuclear power, not surprisingly, turned out to be the poster child for something on the top right corner that was highly dreaded and also seen as very uncontrollable. And so in 2006, I stuck out my neck and sort of said, well, one of the reasons why we don't do very much about climate change is because it doesn't seem to scare us yet. It doesn't seem to score very high on this dread dimension that Slovic et al. Had identified. And I meant that as a dare for people to actually go and check on it. And nobody actually took us up on the dare. So we had to do it ourselves with a PhD student a few years later. And we did the study where sort of people provided with risk judgments of these different societal risks. But now we actually also included climate change. And one thing that was interesting, the nuclear power from the 70s now to 2016 had moved from the top right corner towards the center, in part because we have had lots of other experiences that nuclear power actually isn't all that dangerous. Personal experience sort of coming in. The new poster child for something that's highly dreaded and seen as uncontrollable is terrorism. But to my point about climate change is very much to the left of the midpoint on the dread scale. And so I think sort of our intuition was right. Climate change is not something that keeps us up in the middle of the night. So let's move sort of from risk and uncertainty to deep uncertainty, where oftentimes these days we don't really even know what the unknown unknowns are, what it is that we don't know. And how do we deal with these sort of situations of deep uncertainty? And I want to make the point that there are two ways of dealing with it. One of them is, we basically deal with it by social imitation. If I don't know, what's the best course of action is in this deeply uncertain situation, I might look to others who I think know more, have more expertise, who I trust in a way, and therefore I copy what they're doing. Or we can sort of do it by personal experience and basically sort of figure out based on sort of what our most recent experiences was this sort of deeply uncertain situation. Has it been more or less safe, or has it actually affected us in negative ways? And make decisions based on that sort of small data points, oftentimes of personal experience. In the interest of time, I won't tell you much detail about the setup of this panel that we had during COVID-19, where we followed 5,000 people in 6 waves in the US, a representative sample every few months. But we asked them about decisions both about COVID-19 and their perceptions of risk and so on, but also about climate change and their experiences with extreme weather. And let me just sort of get you to the end of the slides. And so we found that, first of all, yes, people, actually, let's go a couple of slides back. What predicts worry about climate change and COVID? And it was very much people's political ideology. And so this gets to the idea of social imitation. So if you are a Republican, you basically sort of respond to both COVID and to climate change in the way your Republican leaders tell you that sort of this is nothing much to worry about. The Republican worries are much lower than the ones of the other two parties. But however, when both Democrats and Republicans have a lot of negative experience. So first of all, here on the left-hand side, we have people that have no personal experience, negative personal experience with either one of those two hazards. And you can see that there's a big gap because of political ideology. But those people, those Republicans who think that, sort of in this case, climate change is nothing to worry about, when they do collect a lot of negative personal experience with that, all of a sudden they become indistinguishable statistically from in their actions and protective actions from Democrats, because now personal experience and their perceptions of risk as a result of that swamps what they perceive as a risk as a function of political ideology. So there are these two channels, but I think personal experiences dominates the one of imitation and therefore as a result of that, political polarization might actually eventually shrink a little bit. Sara and I also summarized a lot of these considerations about risk being something that is due to a lot of attentional and perceptual processes, but also risk is something that happens in the social networks. It's influenced by sort of others around us, us seeing things and how they're acting and so on. And also risk is affected by what we experience in the larger biophysical environment. Is a hazard something that is harming us or not? And that all of these factors really need to be combined, that risky decisions and the deep uncertainty don't just happen in your own head, but they also happen in your social network, and they happen in interaction with our physical and biological environment. And with that, I want to thank you for your scarce attention and stop sharing and pass the microphone over to Sara.
Can you see the screen?
Yeah, that looks good.
Okay, great. I will probably have to skip some slides at the end, but I can't see the time on my computer. So just let me know when I should wrap up, Ryan.
Okay, sounds good.
You can. Okay, great. Okay, so I'm presenting some work that builds off the work that Elke just presented, and a lot of it is also collaborative with Elke. And okay, so I'll go ahead and start, and I think there's some slides in the beginning that I can skip. So Elke just showed this brief overview of this work we did reviewing many theories of human behavior. The reason we reviewed these theories was to facilitate people modeling natural resource use or other problems of human environment interaction, to have a sort of set of theories that they might turn to if they want to incorporate these in their models. So this paper here, many of you might be familiar with it, by Brian Beckage and team, does this. It tries to incorporate a theory of human behavior, and in particular, how people update their perceived risks as a function of experience of extreme weather, as well as social norms and these other inputs that Elke mentions as well. So they integrate this more realistic view of human behavior into a climate model, the C-ROADS model, that links changes in emissions behavior to changes in average global temperature, which in turn returns the frequency of extreme weather events. And what they find is that the temperature uncertainty associated with the social component is of similar magnitude to that of the physical component. And so how humans behave, how they respond to extreme weather events is important for us to know, because it makes very different predictions about future temperature trajectories. So recently, people have suggested or hypothesized that people's increasing exposure to extreme weather events, so this direct experience with risks that are otherwise unknown or complex, might increase people's concern about climate change. And in particular, this recent paper suggested that in the US, given how extreme weather is distributed across counties, and how that maps on to Republican vote share, that this might actually close the partisan gap in concern about climate change and increase climate change as an issue, a prioritized issue among Republicans as well as Democrats, which has increased already among Democrats in the past 25 years or so, but you see this decrease in general among Republicans. So they hypothesized that increasing exposure could change these patterns. And the findings, though, in the literature are mixed. So people experience extreme weather events, but there are many other inputs to how they perceive these risks. In particular, some studies find that people use motivated reasoning. They interpret events in a way that's aligned with their pre-existing beliefs. They attribute these events differently. They don't all attribute them to climate change. And then these studies also have different ways in which they measure experience, either using self-reported experience or objective measures of experience. They look at different outcomes. Some look at beliefs, some look at risk perceptions, and some look at different types of behaviors, adaptation or mitigation behaviors. And so it's currently still unclear whether increased experience leads to increased risk, and how this increased risk translates into willingness to act, or different actions, different types of actions. So in a recent study, this builds on the study that Elke presented looking at COVID and climate change. What we did in this study is that we looked at exposure to wildfires. This was during the 2021 wildfire season, which was an intense wildfire season, which has now been overshadowed or eclipsed by more recent wildfire seasons in the US. But what we do in this study is that we have individuals indicate their address, they drop a pin, and we leverage variation in exposure to fires merged by obtaining this address with measures of objective fire exposure and proximity to fire exposure. And in this way, we're able to look at how people update their risk perceptions and beliefs following both objective measures of proximity to fires as well as their own subjective measures of exposure, which depart from these objective measures. And we also look at how this exposure impacts their willingness to take different types of behaviors, as well as actual behaviors, but in the context of a survey, so donations to different causes. So the reason that these events might, as Elke already said a little bit about this, but these extreme weather events might make risks that are otherwise distant or abstract salient, and people have referred to these as potentially focusing events that might increase people's concern as well as support for different policies. So what we did in the study, we surveyed 7,000 people living in states that had recently experienced a fire during the 2021-2022 fire season. And we measure these belief in climate change, risk perceptions, as well as different behavioral outcomes. What we find is that there's a significant increase in beliefs and risk perceptions among Republicans who live closer to fires. So on these plots, what you see on the x-axis is distance to the fire. And this is the outcome variable that we were measuring. So we see an increase in belief in climate change. We also see an increase in their perceived risks to extreme weather events, and specifically wildfires in this case. The other thing we see is that proximity to the wildfires doesn't predict more increased support for mitigation or these policies that have more diffuse benefits. However, it does predict significant increase in support for home preparation or personal adaptation measures. And then the other thing we find in this study is that subjective measures, so harm here now is your perceived exposure to the fires, which again depart from the kind of objective measures that we have. We find that these subjective measures lead to much higher predicted values between these subjective measures of exposure and risk perceptions, as well as these different behavioral outcomes that I had mentioned before. Okay, so we find that extreme weather experience predicts risk perceptions, but also tends to turn the focus to short-term personal adaptation measures by highlighting individual vulnerability. We find that Republicans, or maybe those for whom experience offers more information or bigger surprises, update their beliefs and behaviors more. We find that subjective experience data tends to overestimate the effects of risk exposure perceptions, as well as willingness to act. And that alternative objective measures, so also looking at smoke, red warning days, also increase concern and action among all respondents. So this suggests that there could be a window of opportunity for risk communication, though risk communication focused on adaptation behaviors following these events. Okay, so given these patterns, should we expect extreme weather experience to close partisan gaps in the US? So I mentioned that this paper, when I started, there are other inputs to people's behaviors. This includes social norms, which actually wield a really strong effect on people's behaviors alongside their risk perceptions, and increase the variability in our temperature projections, depending on whether people perceive strong pro-climate social norms in their environments. So what we did to answer this question is, this is a collaboration with Martina Maglesic, who's a PhD student, and Vitor Vasconcelos, who's at the University of Amsterdam. We developed an opinion dynamics model that was based on the data that Elke showed earlier, this longitudinal data on climate change experience with extreme weather, as well as risk perceptions. So we developed this model calibrated using this data to simulate polarization in risk perceptions over time, taking into account the projected distribution of extreme weather shocks in different US counties under different temperature scenarios, and also accounting for consistency with prior, so these other motivations, not just how people update their risk perceptions in response to extreme weather, but also the consistency, the tendency to update your beliefs in a way that is consistent with your prior beliefs, so motivated reasoning, and also peer effects, how important social influence and social norms are for individuals. And we calibrated this using that data set. And what we find is that given the level of belief updating and the strength of partisan identities and the influence of social norms seen in the data, as well as the distribution of these extreme weather events, these projected distribution of extreme weather events, we find that consensus, so measured here, consensus is on an index of climate concern. We find that consensus is unlikely across these different temperature scenarios. And we also then test, and this is in part because people are also paying attention to those around them, those in their networks. So we create social networks where there's homophily. Republicans are more likely to be connected to other Republicans. This reflects empirical data on social networks. And people also have the stickiness in their beliefs. And we test then different interventions where you change the social network. So if you were able to desegregate the population, you start to see a reduction in or an increase in consensus, a reduction in this difference among Republicans and Democrats in concern about climate change. And if we introduce an intervention where we increase the risk salience of these extreme weather events, this could be a communication intervention, we similarly see a reduction in the gap. Okay, so we see that these social factors are very important for, there's experience, but there are also these social factors that are very important for how people perceive risks. And so now I'm going to pivot a little bit and first say a little bit about how risk perceptions might be socially transmitted in the household, so intergenerationally transmitted. And then if there's time, I'll say a little bit about how interventions might be used to shift social norms. Okay. So there's a lot of work looking at intra-household socialization of values about different topics, about health behaviors, about political behaviors. And people in these models often assume that socialization happens from parents to children. Parents transmit social norms and values to their children, and these are sort of reinforced through daily life at home. But climate change is an intertemporally asymmetric issue. So adults are more responsible for causing climate change. They bear the costs of mitigation, and they also have more decision-making power. But children face greater impacts of climate change, and so may perceive greater risks associated with climate change. And they might also have greater moral leverage in their arguments, in their, when they talk about climate change in the household with their parents, because they're the ones who will face these consequences. And so they might actually be an effective source of cultural change in such contexts. And so in this study, we asked which pathway is most effective for the transmission of beliefs and attitudes about climate change, including risk perceptions, as well as behaviors. Are children more likely to influence parents, or are parents more likely to influence children? So what we do is, this is a large randomized control study looking at parent-child dyads in India. And we have this immersive environmental education intervention that both gives children and parents separately information about climate-related risks, told through this sort of immersive and interactive educational content, as well as different solutions they can take to address the impacts of climate change. This is mostly focused on adaptation behaviors, but also the kinds of mitigation behaviors that this population can take. The study took place in Patna, Bihar, which is an area that has faced really intense urbanization in recent years, has high environmental stressors such as air pollution and water pollution, and also vulnerability to extreme weather, including floods and extreme heat. So what we find, I'm not going to go through the whole study, but what we find that I wanted to highlight here is that the direct effects of these interventions are stronger among children. They seem to be more responsive to these kinds of educational interventions. But we also find that spillovers, so we have the intervention, either the parent sees the educational intervention or the child sees the educational intervention, and then they interact. And then months later, we measure risk perceptions, behaviors, various outcomes. What we find is that children seem to be a more effective conduit of these climate beliefs and concern about climate change to their parents than vice versa. So we see greater spillovers from children to parents in risk perceptions, also perceived efficacy, and also some behavioral outcomes. So let me just do a time check. Are we okay on time?
Yeah, we have about 8 minutes left in the hour. So if you want to take some questions, you might save a few minutes.
Okay. Okay, so I will wrap up after this. I'll maybe just foreshadow. Okay, so we see that risk perceptions are culturally transmitted. This is through interactions within the household. There are also interactions with peers that are going to influence the behaviors that people take, as well as their perceptions of risk and how important they think climate change is as an issue to address. I'm not going to go into this study, but we've done some work to try and understand which interventions might change social norms around climate change, and how might those interventions be targeted. And I will just conclude, I'll just summarize our findings, which is that interventions that when you have heterogeneous population, where some people are already very concerned about climate change and some people aren't, or some people are very committed to current status quo behaviors like consuming meat, you might have more effects in creating these social norm change or endogenous social change in a society when you intervene on those who are less amenable to that change. But these are also populations that are harder to change. And so we've also shown that these kinds of interventions need to be very sensitive to social identities and political identities to be effective. Okay, thank you.
Thank you both so much. Yeah, fantastic. I've been trying to capture a few of the links in the chat, and I was afterwards organized those and provided a little description of each of those so they're useful. Let's open it up for questions. I'll leave it open and see if people want to just chime in. Feel free to open your mics or drop a question in the chat if you want me to read it out. And just while people are thinking, I do one that I'm curious about that kind of spans both of your talks, and I'm curious about the time lags between either direct experience or some exchange in life circumstance and the update of those risk preferences. Has that been something you've explored, or is that something you're thinking about?
Sorry, could you say that again? I was looking at the chat to make sure I hadn't missed the question.
Yeah, you're fine. You're fine. I'm curious about, is this update that happens that you both mentioned in risk perception something that happens instantaneously with direct experience or with changing life circumstances, or is there some kind of important lag or thing that you've started to study?
I can maybe start to say, I think sort of the process that is assumed to mediate the effect of personal experience is emotion, and in particular the surprise. Yes, as you might have noticed that the slopes for Republicans, were oftentimes steeper than the ones for Democrats, both in Sarah's and my presentations. And I think that's because Republicans oftentimes sort of have the prior that this is not something to worry about, that sort of comes as part of the ideological narrative, and all of a sudden something bad happens to them. And so there's in psychological learning models, there's sort of the surprise effect. And so if something really surprises you and surprises you in a bad way, you're much more likely to update your prior than not. And so that would predict, that these experiences change things fairly quickly. But there's also obviously a cumulative effect, and I don't think we have sort of really studied that in a very fine-grained way. But maybe Sara, you have more to say about that.
Well, I was just going to say that I agree. I think it's immediate, and actually, I think what people have spent more time looking at, and I've done some work on this, is how quickly it fades, the impact of this experience. So there's an interesting study by Fran Moore and Patrick Bayless that I think finds I think probably the fade is, and actually in the work I've done, you see a much steeper decline in experience, but they find that after 8 years, you see pretty much full habituation. I think they're looking at temperature anomalies in their study. And when I've done work on this, we find that after 3 years, you see very limited effects of these kinds of extreme events on people's behaviors. You lose the signal after 3 years.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I mean, it'd be really interesting to to look at the feedback effects of like what your social context is reinforcing. So those feedback loops continue over time to kind of counteract that shock. That might be an interesting thing to study. We have a hand up from David. David, feel free to open your mic if you are able.
Sure. Hi there. It seems like my camera isn't there, but at any rate, thank you for the talk. I just wanted to ask, like, how do you think about like identity being mutable or activating different identities? I'm sure this is encountered in some of the work that you've done or cited, but not knowing it, like we wear different hats. Like you mentioned familial relationships. If you're proceeding through a parental identity, you might be more sensitive to the perspectives of children rather than like a professional identity as someone who is perhaps more invested in a whatever. Yeah, so I'm just curious, like how identity as a variable thing here might how you think about that actually when designing interventions or normative appeals and how they might appeal differently.
Well, I can just say I didn't present this work, but Elke and I have done work where we show that when you do make partisan identities salient, and there's polarization around climate change, like partisan identity, highlighting partisan identities creates increasing divisions when it comes to support for climate policy. And we find that people are willing to pay material costs rather in a lab experiment, but are willing to pay material costs rather than go against their party. And this is just symbolically, they would be going against the party. They'll pay material costs in the context of this game. And so I think one sort of takeaway from that is that highlighting these kinds of identities, or when these identities are closely linked to certain behaviors and you're trying to transition, for example, a society, and you have alignment between certain social identities and behaviors or livelihoods, for example, that being sensitive to those and highlighting maybe, some people have suggested that highlighting superordinate identities, like we as Americans are impacted by climate change, is probably a better way to approach some of these problems. But I don't know, Elke, if you have anything to add there.
Yeah. I mean, just to say that your point is so well taken, David. That's so we all have multiple identities, and in different identities come with different goals, and then oftentimes with different sets of norms. And so the key is to prime sort of the salient identity that might make a difference in a given situation, because goals only influence our decisions when they're actually activated, and activating an identity is a very good way, oftentimes by just background sort of environments, is a very good way of highlighting sort of more sustainability conducive goals and motivations.
Thank you. I would think we're at the end of the hour here, and in order to be respectful of their time, thank you so much, Elke and Sara. I feel free to drop questions in the Slack, continue discussion there, and I will route them to Sara and Elke. You're both welcome to join the Slack as well, but I recognize that everyone's also busy. Thank you. This was a phenomenal set of talks, and very appreciative of you both. So let's give them one more round of applause, or virtual applause.
Thank you for having us.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank
you,
you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, Elke. Thanks, Sara.